Shabbat Shalom. So we have been talking for, Bereshit, the beginning, about the through line, the plot for this entire section of the Torah. Something that I discussed when we first began Bereshit is often lost in our micro focus on different elements of each Torah portion. But now we are basically at the conclusion, and I mean that very directly. Most of the work that needs to be done for all of Bereshit finishes in Yayigash. Because up to this point, we realize, yes, it is our responsibility. God is the one who has tasked us with having our choices, our freedom, and that is not going to be fixed by floods or fires. Instead, it's going to be driven by the pursuit of justice by ourselves, which will not only happen on the grand scheme of things, but also in the microcosm of our own families. And as Hamlet would say, there's the rub. The family portion was the sticking point. God had to work with one group to grow them up, to help them see the proper path to be pursued, and that group was not really getting bigger. We kept failing to turn into a true nation devoted to the ways of God. And as such, everything was delayed. Until now. Because in this Torah portion, right there at the beginning, we see one of the most beautiful scenes of reconciliation that we could ever hope to see. When Judah steps forward and proclaims that he is willing to stay in Benjamin's stead, and Joseph, sending away all the Egyptians, weeps with the fullness of his heart and embraces his brothers, seeks after the welfare of his father, and wishes that they all will come and live together. It is a magical moment, and the one that transforms our people into a people, rather than just fragments of a family, each drifting in their own attempt to follow God's ways. But now, even with something like this, we can overcome, be reconciled, and continue. As we saw in the Haftarah of Ezekiel, this becomes the metaphor for our people's unity and the potential to overcome any division time and time again. But how? How did it happen? I mean, put yourself in Joseph's shoes. You were sold into slavery as the better option just because they wanted to get some money for you rather than just letting you die in a pit. That was the last you remembered of your brothers, while you sat in a pit, listening to them barter with the traveling slave merchants of how much they would get for you. And they pulled you out, sold you, and 20 years you have spent in Egypt. And only the last few have you been doing okay. I mean, sure, you were a bit of a high flyer in Potiphar's house, which was a good position to be in if you were a slave. But he was still a slave in Potiphar's house, and obviously that had its own problems, and then thrown into the prison. And there he languished until finally he was brought out to serve Pharaoh. And now his brothers are here. And he forgives them. He reconciles to them. How? Why? Why didn't Joseph just say, look, guys, you sold me into slavery. I'll take care of Dad. I'll take care of Benjamin. The rest of you can get lost. Just, good luck to you. Been nice knowing you, but I don't want to ever see you again, and Egypt is now a closed door to you. What do you imagine Joseph was thinking when he forgave his brothers, when he reconciled with them? Yes? So very famously, Joseph says, don't worry, it was all part of God's plan. Now, this is something I've discussed in my suffering class, which you can catch up with on the YouTube videos before it resumes after the new year. Joseph is allowed to say that, but would it have worked if his brothers had said that? If his brothers had said, oh, so this is why we sold you into slavery. It was all part of God's plan. God clearly wanted us to sell you into slavery so you'd be in a position to rescue the entire family. Would it have worked if his brothers had made that claim? So why does it work if Joseph makes that claim? Does that really get his brothers off the hook? It's okay, God made you do it. What did we begin with in Bereshit as the fundamental essence of humanity's nature? Choice. If we are really going to say God made them sell Joseph because it was all part of God's intricate plan to save the people during the famine, we might as well just ask, well, why didn't God just not make a famine? Why do you need to sell Joseph into slavery and make him suffer as a slave all of those years just to get them out of a famine that God could have prevented by simply not making a famine in the first place? And does that really mean every murderer is doing God's work? How could we ever say anyone was culpable for any deed that they did? No matter how horrible and horrendous, they could simply say, oh, look at Joseph. Selling a person into slavery is one of the worst things you can do, but hey, it worked out all right. And maybe you haven't seen it work out all right already, but trust me, it's God's plan. God would not have let me murder that person. God would not have let me sell that person as a slave. God would not have let me cheat you if it wasn't part of God's plan. Therefore, there is no responsibility for my behavior. We would be undermining the entirety of creation up to this point as the Torah has laid it out if we were to accept that as a true excuse for what had happened. And indeed, our commentaries do not. They go to great lengths to point out that God steered them to have the idea of selling him into slavery only once it was unavoidable that they were going to try and dispose of him. That God, yes, intervened to rescue Joseph in this manner because their free will dictated this was the best of all possible options that could ever be made. But they are responsible for doing so because had they not wished to sell him into slavery, had they not wished to murder him, then he would not have ended up in Egypt and the family would have been saved from the famine in some other manner. That God would have protected them in some manner that he did with Abraham and with Isaac, who also faced famines. And they didn't need a ringer having been sold years in advance to help them get out of that problem. So no, we can't say that the brothers are exonerated just because it's God's plan. And we can't say that that would be the right reason for Joseph to forgive. It may or may not have been his true reason. But I'd like to think there was a different element of self-reflection that Joseph went through that allowed him to truly forgive them while also recognizing that he had gotten something wrong. This whole debacle between him and his brothers was created, of course, by his father's favoritism, famously with the coat of many colors, but also in every way that Jacob treated Joseph differently from his other brothers. But Joseph exacerbated it by his own actions, by tattling on the sons that came from Bilhah and Zilpah, not a great way to make friends and influence people, but of course, most powerfully, by recounting his dreams. Now, what did the dreams seem to indicate? Anybody remember his dreams? That his brothers should bow down to him. Right? His brothers would bow down. Indeed, his brother said, oh, he thinks he's going to rule over us. Now, on the one hand, we can say, well, that happened. He's the leader of Egypt. His brothers have bowed down to him unknowingly. And he does kind of hold all of Egypt in his hand, second only to Pharaoh, which is kind of fulfilling that dream. So, bada bing, bada boom, Joseph was right. No. Because that is not at all what Joseph imagined when he told his dream to his brothers. And it's not what his brothers imagined that Joseph meant when he told the dreams. In their context, in their small pastoral world, they imagined that Joseph meant, and I think there's good evidence that this is what Joseph meant, that he was going to be in charge of the family. That he would be head honcho among Jacob's children. Now, there was always going to be a head honcho, because that's how the hierarchical families worked of the ancient world. It would have been slated for Reuben, but Reuben messed up. It might have been slated for Shimon and Levi as next in line, but they also messed up with their murdering of the town of Shechem, which Jacob disapproved. So we are left with now an open platform. Who is going to rise up and become the true head honcho? Because the people who were more in line by birth order are no longer acceptable. And Joseph stepped into that moment and said, well, I just had a dream that said it's going to be me. And that was what they were resentful of, that he was proclaiming himself as the winner because he was, after all, the firstborn of the better wife, and therefore he was the one who should take over at this point. He was claiming that he had the right, the authority, and the divine blessing by the vision that he had had while sleeping to be in charge of all of them. And that's what his brothers were resentful of. They did not want somebody who simply thought they could step into this void and take it without their consent, without their approval. And indeed, throughout Jewish history, people who have tried to do this to the Jewish people, to try to proclaim themselves king or pope or whatever other authority they wished without the consent of the community, have ended up in very bad ways. And their lineages have not lasted very long. But it turns out that Joseph realized that he was wrong. That when he had that dream, when he had that vision, it was nothing to do with being in charge of his family. It was nothing to do with ordering his family about and making them kowtow to him as the leader, the firstborn among the rest of the tribes, of I will get to say what we're doing the way Dad's been telling us what to do. Joseph realizes in that moment when he sees them bowing before him that he was raised up not to rule over them, but to save them, to deliver them. And that all of his childish arrogance, all of his childish dreams of, if I were in power, if I were king, that had contributed to his brother's hatred and resentment. That he had acted like a brat. That he had acted like an arrogant, spoiled, and power-hungry person. And he now understands, having been at the bottom of that hierarchy, if you will, at the bottom of the pyramid, just exactly how horrible it is to have somebody lording it over you. What it is like to be in that vulnerable position of servant to Potiphar and then having to somehow decide between doing the right thing or giving in to Mrs. Potiphar and ending up in jail. And then what it's like to live in the Egyptian pyramid, where yes, he may be number two, but he sees what happens to everyone below. And he knows that he too is subject to Pharaoh's whims, should Pharaoh decide to have them. He now realizes exactly what he was projecting towards his brothers, of why they were resentful, of why they were upset, of why they wouldn't want him to be their king. And he also realizes that that wasn't why God gave him that vision, that he had misinterpreted that key dream. He got all the other dreams right, but his own dream was clouded and shaded by his own ambitions and his own youthful arrogance into thinking that he would be in charge. And now when he sees his brothers coming for food, when he sees his family on the brink of starvation, he realizes, I was never meant to be in charge. I was never meant to be their king. I was simply meant to be somewhere that I could help them. And it happens to be that being number two in Egypt was exactly where I needed to be to help them. And now I can forgive them. They hated me because I was hateable. They hated me because I was trying to project a power upon them that I did not deserve and that they did not deserve to live under. No, they shouldn't have sold me into slavery. No, murder wasn't the solution. There were better ways that all of that could have been handled, and they are, of course, still criminals in that respect. But I can forgive them now because faced with that same situation, I think now Joseph understands their motivation. Having been now a slave, Joseph probably had his own fantasies, his own dreams of getting rid of Potiphar, of overcoming the situation, of if only we didn't have Pharaoh. And he realizes his brother trying to nip that in the bud, incorrectly as it were. But he did much to feed their hatred, yes.
I think Joseph, in my opinion, wanted to bring peace to his family for his father's sake. His father was okay.
Well, he definitely wanted his father to not be starving to death in Canaan. But it wasn't as though strife within the family couldn't have been avoided some other way. He could have never revealed himself to the family and still fed them quite well. He didn't need to reconcile himself to the rest of his brothers, or his father for that matter. But his father had already lived 20 years with the thought that he was dead. I'm just trying to point out that I think Joseph had a realization that he was partly to blame for the situation because he had misread his vision. He had misread his dreams. So of course his brothers misread his dreams. And now he recognizes that leadership is not about getting to tell people what to do. Leadership is about having to help overcome the problems, the challenges, the pain, the suffering that those you are leading are facing. And that's the turning point. Because now we're no longer a family with different people squabbling over a piece of dad's inheritance. Now we are a nation that is looking to our leaders and each other to collectively overcome the challenges that we face. Recognizing each family will still have their own dynamic, their own shtick and problems, but that we will have a way among ourselves to resolve those problems, to overcome them, and to ensure that nobody is ever put in this kind of position again. That is what it means to turn into a nation, to realize that rain or shine, good or bad, we are in this together, and that any position of authority is really a position of subservience. That any position of leadership is really a position of responsibility. And with that in mind, we are able to then hold together throughout the terrors of slavery that are about to befall our people, and be ready to accept Torah collectively, no longer just as individual spiritual members of a family, but now as a nation bound together by a higher calling, and recognizing that we, to the world, can have a responsibility to share this idea, to help share that burden, and to alleviate the suffering in the world around us. This is the moment. If Joseph and Judah had gotten it wrong here, we wouldn't exist. If they had gotten it wrong here, God would have had to go back to the drawing board, find a different family, find a different people, try to raise up the proper soil in which a nation could grow that would be willing to accept Torah. It is that turning point, that minor drama, it seems, between two brothers and their family in attendance, that in fact became the crucible for the world's transformation, that allowed for Torah to come in and allowed our nation to share its light. But it also reminds us that's still our responsibility. That is still our duty. That we to each other and we to the world must still live up to the lesson that Joseph and his brothers learned at that moment. That there is more than just climbing the pyramid. There is more than just trying to be number one. And that if you find yourself at the top of the pyramid, you should look at those that are under your leadership with kindness, compassion, and care, because you are not there for any other reason. Joseph misunderstood that when he was a boy, but he understood it finally when he was a man. Shabbat Shalom.